Well, greetings to you all. Here's today's message from January 11th, 2015. We've been focusing our attention over the last week and into the next 5 weeks on the Sermon on the Mount, particularly the last three of Jesus' Beatitudes. But before we get there, I wanted to focus us on the very end of the Sermon on the Mount to see what Jesus is doing through this whole sermon. The main point that we've been focusing on in this sermon series is that kingdom people see the world like Jesus and they act like it. Today I want to add that kingdom people build on a solid foundation. The Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, chapter 5 through Matthew chapter 7, those three chapters. And at the end of chapter 7, we get to the conclusion of this Sermon on the Mount, a very famous parable by Jesus. It's Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27 reads this way. Jesus says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Now, scholar and author Michael Wilkins, in his commentary on Matthew, points out that in the whole of Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, you have three characters that are really in view, or character sets. You have the disciples, and they're really the main crowd that Jesus is talking to. And we have to understand disciples in this sense is not specifically the 12, but just people who have chosen to follow Jesus. For those people, Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, is teaching. He's teaching those people what it means to live in the kingdom of God and live into the kingdom of God. Then you have the crowd. They're sort of neutral onlookers, at least in the first part of Matthew. For those people, Jesus is inviting them into life in the kingdom. And then, of course, you have the religious leaders who Jesus uses as examples, sometimes in his stories and parables. Sometimes they give Jesus problems. For the religious leaders, they oppose what Jesus is doing. So the disciples are being taught, the crowd is being invited, the religious leaders oppose. And if we look at this parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, this is the concluding thought of Jesus in this sermon. We note that kingdom people don't live on easy street. They don't necessarily have it easy. In fact, Jesus doesn't claim that at all. He claims the complete opposite of that. It's not necessarily going to be easy. He acknowledges that there are going to be problems, that there will be storms in life. The question isn't will there be storms, it's how will you weather the storms. Can you weather those storms well, or will your life fall with a big crash? Kingdom people build on a solid foundation. And Jesus doesn't mince words. I mean, if you look at that parable, you can go back and reread it, Matthew 7, 24 through 27. Jesus says you've got two options. You're either wise or you're a fool. That's all he says. He doesn't say there's an in-between option. You're either wise or you're a fool. And the question becomes, if you look at the characters that are in the Sermon on the Mount, if you look at the people he's talking to, it comes down to the question of who am I? Am I a disciple? Have I said yes to Jesus and I follow Jesus? If that's the case, then the Sermon on the Mount, and this particular part of the Sermon on the Mount, is a teaching moment. Yes, I've chosen to follow Jesus, but the challenge becomes, how can I follow him better? How can I get closer to Jesus? How can I bring others into the kingdom? How can I be the best kingdom person Jesus is calling me to be? For those who find themselves part of the crowd, if that's you, Jesus is inviting you. Your foundation is not firm, is what Jesus is claiming. It may look firm. Before the rains come, the foundation on the sand looks perfectly fine until the water comes. Maybe you're in another position. You know it's not a solid foundation. Life has gotten hard. You do feel like the foundation has washed out underneath and things have come down with a great crash. Jesus is inviting you, if that's where you find yourself. And he invites you into the kingdom, into life with him, to follow Jesus. That's what he invites you to. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is inviting us to. It's inviting us and teaching us how to live as followers of Jesus Christ. Kingdom people see the world like Jesus, and they act like it. And kingdom people build on a solid foundation. The question is, how solid is your foundation?